Batman has a very rich history in animation dating back to the 1960s, and it makes sense, I suppose, given that he's a comic book character that appeared in brightly coloured over-the-top stories in a world filled with equally extravagant characters. And animation is just moving drawings after all. Over the decades there have been a variety of interpretations of his characters. Some of them are more extreme than others, and given some of the recent discourse around Batman Caped Crusader, I thought it would be interesting to talk about how these characters have been adapted over the years. To kick things off, I wanted to look at the various animated versions of the Penguin, given that he is one of Batman's most well-known villains, and the fact that he's arguably the villain that has seen the most changes over the years. I'll be looking at how he was adapted across several shows. 1968's The Adventures of Batman, 1977's The New Adventures of Batman, 1992's Batman the Animated Series, 1997's The New Batman Adventures, 2004's The Batman, and 2024's Batman Caped Crusader, with a brief shout out to Brave and the Bold and Justice League Action, given that he made brief appearances in those shows. So the first show on my list is The Adventures of Batman. This show tries to be a faithful adaptation of the comic books of the time. It's lighthearted, zany, and has very crude animation, so much so that some people may argue that it's barely animated at all. And that's not me throwing shade at the show. This was very typical of kids' cartoons of the time. Low budget, basic stories with interchangeable villains. Their version of the Penguin carries on in the tradition of the 1966 Batman TV show, whose Penguin was played by the late Burgess Meredith. Having said that, the Penguin is pretty forgettable in this version, much like the show itself. That's not to say that the show wasn't faithful to the source material of the time, just that it was a fairly poor era for both Batman and animation as a whole. The Penguin is just one of many colourful rogues that live in Gotham City, with a penchant for thievery. The New Adventures of Batman, produced about a decade later, fares similarly, although it had the misfortune to be released while the comic books were going through a dark renaissance. It's also worth highlighting that the Penguin was notably absent from the comics during this period, because he didn't fit very well with the mature tone they were aiming for. In a way, that makes the outdated scripts and low-budget animation and vocal performances feel even worse. The New Adventures of Batman brought back Adam West and Burt Ward to the roles of Batman and Robin, but again, their plots were fairly basic, with all the trappings of kids' cartoons of the time. Basic animation, repetitive music, and a zany little guy in the form of Batmite to act as the butt of all jokes. Their Penguin isn't really all that different from the earlier version, although his schemes are a bit more outlandish. In one episode he invents crime slime, which can reportedly turn anyone into a criminal, and it causes him to swap bodies with Batmite, for some reason. Now I don't want to be too harsh, and I'm sure this show has its fans. The thing to remember is that this was the standard of kids' TV shows during that time, so I'm not trying to dunk on it too much. It's not that this show was substandard, far from it. Just compare it to its contemporaries, the Super Friends, Scooby-Doo, Captain Caveman, and so on. But by modern standards, it's not particularly interesting. I will say that the versions of the Penguin seen in The Adventures of Batman and The New Adventures of Batman are probably among the most comic book accurate renditions of the Penguin though. At least accurate to how he was characterised back then. This brings me to Batman the Animated Series' version of the Penguin. Now this version of the character is quite interesting. Originally he was intended to be more like what we had seen before, a portly little man with a large nose that committed robberies, but the hook would have been that he had severe mother issues. However, these plans were scrapped when Warner Brothers executives decreed that their Penguin should resemble Danny DeVito's Penguin from the then upcoming film Batman Returns. This meant that their Penguin became a weird-looking mutant man with flippers for hands. And the creative team had a curious reaction to this. They just sort of gave up on using him. Given that he was the villain of the upcoming Batman movie, a lot of freelance writers pitched stories with the Penguin, and many of them were subpar. Hello, I've got Batman in my basement. And you have to remember that at this point in time, the standards of cartoons were very different. I don't want to suggest that these writers are incompetent. They simply didn't realise what the assignment was. However, given that at that point the show had to get episodes into production, several of these subpar scripts actually got made. At Fan Expo Salt Lake City in 2017, BTAS story editor, the late Martin Pascoe, described how most of the Penguin scripts weren't very good, and they would be sent to him to work on to try and improve them. The earlier version of the Penguin committed bird-themed robberies, stealing Fabergé eggs, an experimental helicopter named after a bird, and so on. Which really seems quite quaint in comparison to the more tragic, emotionally deep villains that the series is well known for. Arguably, there's really only one episode starring the Penguin that is any good, and that's Birds of a Feather. In this episode, the Penguin attempts to reintegrate into high society, but is mocked by those that he views as his peers, and so he lashes out in revenge. The emotional hook for Beatas's Penguin was that he viewed himself as being one of society's elites, just temporarily inconvenienced by the fact that he had no money, but high society would never accept him. It's just a shame that it took him so long to figure out this hook. This characterization was only really touched upon once, but it left a mark. Outside of this, the Penguin is probably best used as a supporting character. His cameo appearances in episodes like Almost Got Him and Second Chance are delightful, but too much time spent with him reminds the audience of how silly he is. The inconsistency in his portrayal lets this version of the character down, even though it is the version that comes to mind when I think of the Penguin. By the time the new Batman adventures came about, the Tim Burton Batman films were old news, so the creative team were free to revert to their original plans, although they made some adjustments based on how the Penguin had been portrayed in the comic books of the time. While they reverted to the original design, he was reimagined as the owner of the hottest night spot in town, the Iceberg Lounge. To the world at large, Oswald Cobblepot had reformed and was a successful businessman. In secret, he acted as a fence, assisting the criminals of Gotham to sell their stolen goods, and as an arms dealer. The only issue with this version of the character is that we didn't get to see much of him. He was a supporting villain in 3 episodes, The Ultimate Thrill, Joker's Millions, and Judgment Day, although he really only did anything of note in The Ultimate Thrill, where he decided that working with the adrenaline junkie Roxy Rocket was bad for business, and tried to murder her. He would go on to appear in 2003's Batman Mystery of the Batwoman as one of the primary antagonists, sharing the spotlight with Rupert Thorne, Carlton Duquesne, and Bane. In 2004, a new Batman cartoon hit the airwaves, and in many ways it was the antithesis of Batman the Animated Series. Rather than featuring deeply profound and sympathetic villains, the Batman focused on action and was generally more light-hearted. Their version of the Penguin is presented as a parallel to Bruce Wayne. Oswald Cobblepot was a wealthy elite, but he was as ugly on the inside as he was externally. He wasn't at all sympathetic. He was crass, rude, and egotistical. He was envious of Bruce Wayne because Bruce Wayne was everything Oswald had wanted to be. Handsome, popular, and respected. Much like Bruce Wayne, Oswald Cobblepot had travelled abroad to learn martial arts, but rather than improving himself to help others, he learned these skills to aid his criminal career. Along the way, he picked up a silent set of kabuki twins with razor fingers that acted as his bodyguards. Presenting him as a twisted reflection of Bruce Wayne was an inspired move, and this is an easy to understand hook. He was very well fleshed out and was arguably the most prominent villain in the series, appearing in almost 20 episodes across 5 seasons. This Penguin is arguably the most consistent of all Penguins, and for that reason, I would say that this is probably the best one overall, although your mileage for kung fu fighting little people that resemble a rockhopper penguin may differ. Additionally, I feel like the Batman's more child-friendly tone, a cartoon made with children in mind, is another reason why I don't really engage with that show. It wasn't made for me, and that's fine. After the Batman, there were 2 other cartoons that briefly featured the Penguin, so I don't really feel the need to go into depth about them. In 2008's Batman the Brave and the Bold, he was characterized in a similar style to Burgess Meredith's Penguin. The same was also true of 2016's Justice League Action's version of the Penguin. He wasn't a significant character at all in either of those shows, and again, that's fine. Both of those shows were more of a spotlight for the other heroic characters in the DC universe, with the villains generally taking a backseat role. The latest version of the Penguin appeared in 2024's Batman Caped Crusader, and oh boy, they really went all out with this one. This is arguably the most different version of the character, and not just because their Penguin is a woman, Oswalda Cobblepot. At first I didn't really care for the name, but thinking about it, if they named her anything else, then viewers would dismiss her as either the mother, sister, or daughter of the real Penguin Oswald. As Oswalda, you can't really deny that she is intended to be the Penguin. Physically, she towers over everyone and resembles one of those massive emperor penguins. She's not a short, dumpy weirdo. She's a beloved figure and is lovingly called the Penguin, but her bright and bubbly penguin identity is a facade. Of all of the versions of the Penguin, I'd argue that she is the most wicked. While other versions of the Penguin have been jealous and spiteful, nothing they have ever done came close to the evil acts of Oswalda. While she presents herself as a cabaret singer at her own club, the Floating Iceberg Lounge, and putting on fundraising events for the GCPD, in secret, she's a drug-dealing gangster, skimming money from the GCPD's funds, trying to muscle in on Rupert Thorne's territory. She uses a hidden military-grade cannon, masked as an umbrella, on top of her club to destroy Thorne's warehouses and then pays city officials to pass off the explosions as accidents. However, when Thorne implies to her that he has escaped death because one of her sons told him what she was up to, Oswalda orders her henchman Iggy to drown her youngest son, Aaron. We later see her underwater graveyard where there are dozens of corpses stuffed into suitcases at the bottom of the sea. This penguin has been very busy, never mind all the people she killed when blowing up Thorne's businesses. She tells her last remaining son, Ronald, that Aaron had been her favourite son, but now that makes him her favourite by default. If that's how she treats her favourite, just imagine what she'd do when she learned that Ronald was the real traitor. When she is informed that she had killed the wrong son, she shows no remorse or concern. She doesn't even acknowledge that Aaron was innocent and isn't even remotely fazed by the prospect of murdering both of her children. She just decides to use her cannon to blow up Ronald and everyone else in the GCPD. When Batman tries to stop her as the police circle the Iceberg Lounge, Penguin manages to fire the cannon, telling Batman that when she loses, she makes sure that everyone else loses too. She's far more threatening and spiteful than the earlier versions of the Penguin, and with time and a few more appearances, I think this could become a contender for the best animated version of the Penguin. I will always love Beatass's Penguin, but he wasn't handled with any consistency and was generally underutilised. The Batman's Penguin, meanwhile, was consistent, fairly well written, and appeared in a lot of episodes, but I'm not really into the weird little person that knows Kung Fu. Other cartoons have been faithful to the traditional comic book version of the Penguin, a bird-themed thief in a tuxedo, and they're fine, there's nothing wrong with that at all. Oswalda, meanwhile, has a lot of potential, but we need to see more of her. One episode just isn't going to cut it. Caped Crusader is aimed at a slightly older audience, early teens, versus the Batman, which was aimed at a younger audience. This means that Oswalda could be more heinous, which is likely why I, as an adult, view her as the superior villain. It may sound obvious, but one thing I found particularly interesting about doing this comparison was seeing how the standards of the time impacted the way the characters were presented. During the 60s and 70s, when kids' cartoons had to be all age appropriate with no complex themes, the Penguin was pretty basic. Yes, these shows were low budget, and by modern standards, they're pretty poor. Then in the 90s, when Batman the Animated Series debuted, the quality of the show was light years ahead of what had come before, even with a character like the Penguin who was still presented as a bird-themed weirdo, at least in the early episodes before he became a multifaceted character. In the 2000s, we saw a level of consistency that we hadn't seen before with the Batman's version of the Penguin. He was treated as a significant villain, even if most of his schemes weren't particularly noteworthy. And in 2024, where the standards of streaming platforms like Amazon Prime Video are significantly laxer, we've arguably had the most villainous version of the character yet. Despite all of these differences, each of these versions is still very recognisably the Penguin, and I guess that is a testament to the quality of the character overall. Okay, that's it for this week's essay. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really enjoyed the video and have the means, please consider making use of the thanks button to send a buck or two my way, because every little helps. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 a month. This will get you early access to my weekly video essay, priority responses to your comments, members-only videos, custom emojis, and an icon on your profile indicating that you're one of my people. And special thanks to my current channel members, who are all listed on the screen right now. Next time I'm going to continue my villain comparison series by looking at how Clayface has been presented over the years. He's been a petty thief, a tragic monster, a disgraced former friend of Batman's, and a serial killer. And we're going to talk about them all. Hope to see you then.